For today, we are talking about which are the hardest specs to play in the raid, but not just about a rotation perspective. We're not just trying to tell you, hey guys, Feral Druid is harder to play than Red Paladin and Shadow Priest is harder to play than BM Hunter. We are including other things that happen when you are inside of a raid. Sometimes you might have heard your raid leader mention them. They are called mechanics. They are called raid mechanics. And these things can affect how hard it can be for a certain spec to play because, for example, you have to move. You have to move, you have to spread, you have to run away, you have to stack, which means how fast you can move, how fast you can teleport or blink or dash around can make your spec easier to play, for example. Then there is also the issue of defensives. Certain bosses will have very high damage, very dangerous phases, which can be made easier by specs that can be far more tanky. And then you have the question same with mobility, for example, or with immunities, for example, where you have to give mechanics like run here, pick up this thing, soak the mine far away on Sprocket, for example, or do the bombs on Galliwix, for example, where specs that are more mobile are assigned these kind of mechanics. Or of course soaks with immunities, for example, on Maxi, where you need specs with immunities, or immunities to protect players from the rockets on Sprocket, for example. All of these extra things which go beyond just, how simple is your rotation. So obviously, we have to start talking about the chilling rank where we just put all of the tanks, because really no matter their state, it's just raid tanking. It's nowhere near the level of responsibility and the level of decision making you have when you have to mythic plus tank, which is almost reversed in terms of ranking when it comes to the raid. It's much easier to play a tank. You will have a couple of fights where you have some movements where good tanks will save you some wipes, right? But overall, it's pretty chilling to play a tank in the raid. Now, as for healers have traditionally danced between the bottom two of the difficulty levels in the raid, depending on how many mechanics are going to the entirety of the ranged camp, or how many mechanics are going only to DPS players in the ranged camp. For example, the big hit where you have to run out from the group on one-armed bandit is still hitting all of the ranged healers, not just the DPS only. Or on Sprocket, if you can get the drills, you can get the drills as a healer as well. So for most of the fights where the mechanics are shared between healers and DPS, the ranged healers will have the worst jobs generally, as taking care of all of your raid frames and trying to heal is generally more high stress than playing out your rotation as a DPS, with the exception of the melee healers, for the simple fact that the melee healers most of the time can pretty much ignore many of the mechanics that will not target them. For example, if you were playing on one-armed bandit as a Mysterious Monk, you can completely ignore the big hit mechanic or even the flame debuff mechanic, because it will never go on a melee player, and these two specs are coded as melee. So you are completely ignoring a big chunk of mechanics. Same goes for the drills on Sprocket. As long as you have enough ranged players, the drills on Sprocket will never go on these two specs, but it can go on all of the rest of the healers. They can cheese quite a few mechanics compared to the rest of the healers, which, as mentioned, are, sort of bouncing between the bottom two tiers in terms of easiness in the raid. If you even were to judge them based on their rotation, their timings and whatnot, then probably like Holy Priest and Resto Shaman will be slightly above the other two, possibly even Resto Druid. Where you do definitely have more variance though is in the DPS. Because for healers, especially the part about tankiness, especially the part about surviving dangerous mechanics, well, they are healers themselves. They can always heal themselves first. They can always use their own external on themselves first and stay alive themselves first, which is not really something that the DPS specs can do. They are sort of at the mercy of the healers once they are out of their own defensives and your own health potion and your own health stone. We are in an interesting conundrum right now, because some of the arguably easiest specs to pilot right now could be Balance Druid, as well as BM Hunter, as well as Devastation Evoker. If you just went based on the rotation, right, based on how many buttons they have to press, how difficult the spec is to play, these specs are very straightforward and very simple. However, funnily enough, these three right now are also the three specs that are dying the most in Mythic Raid. These three specs are dying in 23, 22 and 22% of the pools in Mythic. So basically, a bit more than 1 every 4 pools, these three specs are gonna die. They're gonna be dead in the pool. So is it because the average player base of these three specs is garbage and they just keep dying to mechanics, or is it because these specs are playing a tough job in the raid? Perhaps because they are immobile, which is not really seemingly the case because all these three specs are reasonably mobile, extremely mobile for Devastation, very mobile for BM, and pretty mobile for a Druid. It could be because of a mix of the poor-ish defensives they have in the raid mixed with their very high mobility pushing them to do a lot of the mechanics or be targeted for quite a few of the mechanics, or rather assigned by the raid leader to take care of a bunch of mechanics. The rework of the Hunter General 3 did make BM Hunter definitely more tanky than it's what it used to be, but Dev and Balance are still pretty weak in terms of defensives. So considering the sheer amount of deaths they have in the raid right now, plus their very high mobility, which tends them to be usually the default target, for example, to go on the late, lone, mines, far away on Sprocket, for example, or Hunter, of course, being given the beta cuck job of doing the coins on One-Armed Bandit, it might not make them, as easy to play as it seems, just from their, from their rotation only. There might be some more extra things that being so mobile is going to entail, on top of not having very good defensives. Meanwhile, in reverse, talking about the what seemingly are the simpler specs, you have Unholy DK, you have Frost DK, you also have Havoc Demon Hunter, you also have Ret Paladin, as well as Outlaw Rogue. So we have the quintet collection of melee specs. These are amongst the tankier, sturdiest, and least deathest specs in Mythic Raiding. They are all specs that are very sturdy, they have very good defensives or self-healing, especially in the case of both Ret and both of the DKs. They are extremely tanky. It's very hard for them to die to straight-up mechanics and lack of defensives or lack of survival tools in the raid. On top of that, they are melees. So, as melee specs, they rarely get, key mechanics they have to deal with, or the rest of the raid is going to die. As mentioned, for example, they won't be getting the drills on Sprocket. They will hardly, if ever, be assigned to go in Africa to deal with the mines far away on Sprocket. They won't have to do the coins on One-Armed Bandit. It's easier to stay towards the bottom of the room than to stay in the middle of the room to give you time to see the coins coming or the flames coming, since the players get dispelled from the opposite side of the room. And then, of course, you have the innate easy part of being a melee where, the HD, left, right, spazzing around doesn't actually punish you, doesn't actually interrupt any of your casts. So you're free to move around most of the time. It makes it much more chill to play in the raid. Not to mention that at the end of the day, neither one of these rotations have the SD specs is particularly complicated, if not straight up extremely easy in terms of rotations. Yes, you might need some carpal tunnel treatment if you play Outlaw Rogue for too much, but in terms of the assignments in the raid, the difficulty you have in the raid, it is very laid back, even with taking into account some of their weaknesses we mentioned, other specs do not have, like being very immobile. For example, it's not really hurting these specs too much. Now, while these might be easy, you have practically the remaining bunch of melee specs being right above the chill mark, for the very simple fact, as we mentioned, of being a melee spec. If we really have to rate the difficulty of the specs in just based on their roles in the raid, usually it's gonna be healer, ranged, melee, and tank. And then you have some bosses where it's like ranged DPS that do have assignments and do have extra jobs, and then healer, and then normal ranged DPS, and then melee, and then tank. But in terms of the role itself, the basic role of the melee itself, the amount of mechanics, you're not too busy with is not that big. For example, even going early on in the raid, back when bosses were a bit harder, of course, fights like Rick Reaver, having to remember and deal with all of the pylons and going up to break the pylons and then suck the energy of the pylons, was mostly a ranged DPS and a healer job. Melee had to do nothing. Targeting the spread Pyromancer adds was mostly a ranged thing. Melee could just cleave the biggest clump of adds in the middle. The toy job on Cauldron was generally a hunter, maybe a mage or a balanced druid job, not a melee. Same as we mentioned, the jobs you don't do on Sprocket as a melee player, even on One-Armed Bandit back when it was tough still. Melee was mostly just ignoring all of the spread cleaving and just chilling on one of the adds, while many of the casters had to triple multi-cleave the 3 adds while dodging the flames coming from 10 yards behind them, while dodging the coins also coming from shortly behind them, also having to deal with the big hit boss mechanic that wasn't affecting the melee players. So practically in almost all situations it's a more chill job than a ranged DPS. There are very few situations in here where your rotation is so complicated or requires so much good timings or good usage of abilities, like maybe Windwalker Monk, where it could be seen as harder, or in some other cases where, for example, your tankiness is so squishy, it's so much harder for you to stay alive, like for a Feral Druid, for example, who is much squishier than, for example, a DK, that would make the fight much harder. Back in the pre-nerf versions of Maxi, the bomb explosions were a much chiller deal for a DK than they were for a poor Feral Druid, for example. If we really had to put a couple of outliers for melee specs in terms of difficulty, would be these two probably. And then the remaining ones are the leftover ranged we have. They're, despite being just slightly less mobile than BM, is pretty much on the same category of hunter. Where you have more questions is, for example, between specs like the Warlocks and the Mages. Because technically, both of them are very tanky, both of them have very good sets of defensives. Warlock is much better at also dealing with rot damage, whereas Mages are better at having proactive cooldown for each of the damage events and not nearly as powerful against rot damage. But either way, both classes are very tanky. Mage, though, is much more mobile than a Warlock. Even including Warlock having access to the Demonic Gateway and their own circle, they are still less mobile than a Mage. So generally speaking, if you are playing Mage, you will be given, more tools, more assignments, more things you have to deal with than your average ranged spec. Now you could have some asterisks in here, like usually, for example, Frost Mage is much easier and simpler to play than Arcane and Fire. However, Frost doesn't have a cheat that. Also, Arcane doesn't have a cheat that, so perhaps staying alive becomes harder than for a Mage. That is Fire, that does have a cheat that. Arcane Mage also has been ping-ponging back and forth in its builds between a build that is more Arcane Blast focused, which makes you more stationary, more like a turret, which is hurt way more by movement, and then other builds which focused more on Arcane Missiles or Arcane Barrages, making them much more mobile and suffering less for having to move around. Meanwhile, Warlocks would, likely be more in the, in the mid level because of, as mentioned, because of their tankiness. Despite not being super mobile, they still have decent mobility. They are also very tanky. They are ranged, sure, so they will get their fair share of mechanic and assigned to their fair share of mechanics. But usually when you think about it, they obviously won't be assigned mechanics nearly the same rate, for example, as a hunter or as a mage. So if you really had to even pick out one spec, one range spec, possibly in terms of rotation, it would be Destro Warlock to be the one closer to the chill range of the melee tanks and the rest of the gang. Not that Affliction and Demo are super complicated, but compared to Destruction, they are probably a bit, just a tad bit higher. It would have been a fair race between putting them as the simpler one and Devastation, but Devastation also has the ranged penalty. They have to position slightly better than Destro Warlock, and they are also significantly squishier than a Destro Warlock, so mechanics in the raid can be far more deadly to a Dev Evoker than they are to a Destro Warlock. Now, as for the remaining three, well, Augmentation, we haven't seen Augmentation in a while, to be fair, but given how straightforward and simple their rotation is, and as mobile as they are, with a Devastation Evoker pretty much on par with them. They are, however, slightly tankier than Dev, simply because they also have a little help. I am told it's pretty helpful. It's called a cheat death, which is something Augmentation has. So basically the equal version of Dev, who is also tankier and with a cheat death, becomes a simpler version. Now the remaining two are pretty interesting because, you know, both of these specs are reasonably immobile. Elemental has Gust of Wind, a pretty scuffed kind of dash. Shadow Priest doesn't even have that. Both of them are pretty mediocre in terms of defensives. Shadow Priest has very little and then a strong dispersion every couple minutes. Elemental has a few more options, but still not amongst the tankiest of the specs. So between not being the tankiest of the specs, also not being the most mobile of the specs, you do end up having to risk more deaths whenever there is to dodge, to move around from lasers, beams, frontals, and swirlies. You can't just say, fuck it, we blink and dodge all of the bad. You actually have to dodge all of the bad when you're playing these two specs. As well as big damage events, you actually can't just pop some ridiculous defensive as nearly as often or as many of the other specs. So it's harder for you to survive. The downside for this is that because you are so immobile and because you have no immunities, you won't really be assigned for many crucial key points in a fight. As mentioned, usually these assignments are going to go to mages, to hunters, maybe to balanced druid. If you're talking about immunities, of course it won't come to you, but to other immunity specs, so you will be left to the sideline. Your rotation is definitely simpler as elemental than it is for Shadow Priest, so it would probably end up being in a case-by-case basis. There are going to be fights where the amount of movement required won't be really nearly as much, in which case this spec can be seen somewhere around here, where you're just chilling in the middle of the group, doing your rotation, not being assigned to any annoying things, because the raid is going to have assigned like this, and this to do the mechanics. And then other fights where there's going to be much more to move, much more to dodge, and much more to quickly move around from, like for example all of P1 of Galliwix pretty much will be far more annoying to play as a spec like Shadow and Elemental, for example. Which is why probably overall we can just double up the line over here in the middle and put them over here. Depending on the fights, they can go up and down depending on how much their weaknesses are being exposed. And this is roughly how hard it's going to be to play each spec in the raid based on how squishy they are, or rather how tanky they are, how are their movement abilities, which can both be good and bad. They can be good because they can dodge bad things more easily, but they can be bad because you can be so mobile, you can be assigned mechanics, so more responsibility is on you. Doing extra mechanics is now on you compared to a spec who is less mobile. Obviously things can get harder for many of the DPS. You can practically scale all of the DPS one tier more when it comes to min-maxing the absolute highest of your DPS, because, you know, a healer is going to be healing the same whether or not you are trying hard or not, or you're trying to squeeze all the healing you can or not. You're just going to be healing players who take damage, whereas for a DPS, try to min-max, try to push the max amount of damage you can do without griefing mechanics, without ignoring mechanics, can have a higher ceiling overall than a healer. But in general, just talking about practically how many things you will have to worry about in the raid, how many mechanics you will have to worry about in the raid and deal with, and be preoccupied with your movement or with your defensives, and the amount of them that will be assigned to you or that you will have to deal with in the first place. This is what more or less you can expect with when going into a raid. So yeah, it is following still more or less the angle of tank into melee, into ranged, into healer, with a few exceptions here and there. Now though, after going through with this, we are now done with each other on this, I believe, Monday. This new first day of the week, right at the beginning of June. It is now time to leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I hate it when it's still hot, but the clouds come up, air starts getting watery and dense, and now it feels 10 degrees as hot as it's supposed to be.